Good evening and welcome to After Hours, and I'm pleased that Katrina Pacey is joining us. It's taken a little while for us to be able to get together and do this show. And Katrina is a lawyer with Pivot, and welcome to the show.
Welcome
to After Hours.
Thank you.
So if people know that prostitution is legal in this country, and I've had recent discussions where they may or may not know, and if they do know, they can't wrap their heads around the fact that it would need to be decriminalized, prostitution. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah. So the act of prostitution, so exchanging sex for money, has never been a criminal act in Canada. It's never been illegal to exchange sex for compensation. What has been illegal is many of the activities that surround it. So operating an indoor venue like a brothel or a body house or working from your apartment is against the law. It's against the law to communicate in public for the purpose of prostitution, so street solicitation, as well as a procuring offense, which is kind of anyone who's a manager or anyone who's kind of in a third party type of arrangement with a sex worker. So those have been against the law for decades, if not more. And it's those provisions that sex workers have been challenging and saying we need to strike down because those provisions stand in the way of sex workers' ability to work more safely. So decriminalization really means kind of taking those criminal laws out of the way and making it no longer a criminal matter insofar as it's consensual adult sex work, and using different laws to regulate it as opposed to criminal law. So that's really what decriminalization means, and that's part of the understanding or the education that seems to be happening is people getting their heads wrapped around the fact that it's being criminalized in these particular ways, and that people would like those laws to be struck from the books.
So how do escort services exist?
So there's only one way to do sex work legally in Canada, and that's to operate on your own, to work to take a phone call from an indoor venue or a private venue, so to not communicate in public about the transaction, and then to go out to meet a client somewhere else. So escorting, as it's commonly referred to, is legal as long as you do it by yourself, as long as you don't work with anybody else or work for anybody else. But if you have a client come to you in your apartment or in somewhere that's like a massage parlor or any other location, you're violating the body house provision. If you work with others, you're in violation of the procuring law and the living on the avails provision. And if you have any part of the communication in public, you're violating the communication law. And so you can see that the laws make it very hard to do sex work legally in Canada, even though there are some specific ways in which you could. And also the other piece that's important is that we know that the police and cities and many of us turn a blind eye to the fact that prostitution is happening all around us, even though they might be violating criminal laws. There's many circumstances we can point to where law enforcement doesn't pay any attention, probably because it's not bothering anybody.
So how could it be legal to be a prostitute or to trade money for sex? You know what I mean? Like, what's the point of having a law like that if everything surrounding it doesn't allow you to do it?
Yeah.
Talk a bit about that.
Yeah. So
major contradiction.
Yeah, there's a major contradiction, or it's a great sort of hypocrisy, we call it. It's a hypocrisy because it's both the core activity is legal or not criminal, but everything around it is criminalized, sort of indoor work, outdoor work, working together. So there's a hypocrisy there. And the other really important hypocrisy is the fact that while there are all of those other laws, we know that they're enforced very selectively. And what we've seen in Vancouver is the selective enforcement has been largely targeting street-based workers. So most law enforcement, about 93% is the statistic we know, targets street-level sex work. And the most sort of public or visible aspect of the sex trade. And if you think about the effect that has, it means that police are picking on the most vulnerable women and their clients, but the most vulnerable women who we know are at the greatest risk of danger. So it's hypocritical in my view in two ways. One, because there's these weird contradictory criminal laws, and then the second is the way we enforce the laws, targeting those who are the most at risk anyway, making them even further vulnerable.
Okay, so not just you, but you and a woman from Toronto, I believe it was Toronto, and women sex workers took a case to the Supreme Court, and I want to do a bit of a history. How did this case to the Supreme Court get started? Where did it start?
Sure. So there are two cases, and I'll refer to one as Bedford, and that's the case of Canada versus Bedford, Leibovitz, and Scott, 3 sex workers from Toronto who initiated a case in 2007. And they started the action in the Ontario Superior Court, which is the lowest kind of level court for that type of case in Ontario. And they challenged 3 provisions of the code, which is the body house law that makes it illegal to work indoors, communication law, which is the public solicitation law, and the living on the avails provision. So they started their case in 2007 at the same time that 2 plaintiffs started a case in BC, SWAV, which is Sex Workers United Against Violence, and Cheryl Kisselbach, and I'll refer to that as the SWAV case. So these 2 cases started in 2007 with different sort of perspectives, I guess. The same outcome was sought by both, in both cases. What they wanted to do was say that these laws are unconstitutional, violate sex workers' right to personal safety and liberty, and wanted to have those laws struck down. But they were different cases in that they were brought in different provinces. And the case in BC was very much brought by street-based sex workers, and I was counsel and am counsel in that case. And they wanted to bring forward the perspective of street-based sex workers from the Downtown East Side to show the very egregious harms that are created by the criminal laws. And the Ontario case had more, I'm just going to say more diversity in terms of the plaintiffs or the sex workers who brought the case forward, in that they worked indoors, they worked on the street, they had much more of a diversity of experience, and so the case wasn't only driven by kind of that street-based sex worker perspective. And it's the Ontario case that actually successfully made its way through the various levels of court and went to the Supreme Court of Canada last year. The SWAV case had a whole other story that we can talk about, but it's the Bedford case out of Ontario that's the one that was at the Supreme Court of Canada last year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so did the 2 groups work together? Like, were you in contact with them, and how did that all happen and work out?
So the idea at the outset, being committed to the same outcome and being part of the same movement, was to have the cases move up through the various levels of court in each province and join, hopefully, at the Supreme Court of Canada. Because the SWAV case had its own difficulties, which we can talk about, what ended up happening is that SWAV, as well as 2 other Vancouver-based organizations, collectively intervened in the Ontario case to bring that perspective to the Ontario litigation and show support for the Ontario. So they joined on both at the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada as interveners, and had the opportunity to argue in that context and bring that perspective to that litigation. So it was a really powerful kind of merging of these voices and these regional kind of perspectives.
Well, a bigger group, it would make sense.
That's
has
right.
more power.
Yeah.
Now talk about the downtown, the women you worked with. Now I think it really started, I won't say small, but did it start with women telling their stories and talk about affidavits, and you sort of getting involved in this and getting involved with these women?
So I started as a law student in my first year of law school, wanting to, having been involved in activism and social change work, really wanting to try to make a difference in the Downtown East Side. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know, frankly, I don't think I knew anything about the Downtown East Side. I just saw it as a neighborhood that needed more human rights sort of defense happening, more people down there who were really committed to the human rights of the people that were suffering from a range of sort of issues in that neighborhood. So I started volunteering down there with Pivot Legal Society, which was just a sort of fledgling organization at the time. And I started my first year really looking at the issue of police brutality in the neighborhood and the relationship between marginalized people in that community and the police, which was a very difficult relationship for a whole bunch of reasons. In the course of that, of course, started to realize and learn more about the very, very significant violence sex workers and women in that neighborhood were experiencing. Of course, this was before Picton's arrest, and this was at a time when the tragedies were all around us, and you couldn't. It was just impossible to ignore it, nor would you want to. And so I sat down in a borrowed space in the neighborhood with women and just had coffee and snacks, and decided to just do what Pivot does, which is really turn to people who are facing these issues and ask them what Pivot might be able to do to help. And the women who came to those meetings made it absolutely clear that it was the circumstances in which they were doing sex work that was placing them at really incredible risk of violence and murder. And that the laws were a huge contributor to those circumstances. There were other contributors, such as poverty, such as, but at its core, there was the fact that they were criminalized for doing sex work. They were forced to work in absolutely unbelievably dangerous circumstances, and they couldn't go to the police for help. And that was in 2001, 2002, and that was the call to action for Pivot and for myself, where I was sort of faced with the quite challenging question, frankly, about whether to wade into the great debate about prostitution and the laws and what do we do about it. Not a debate I necessarily wanted to get involved in because it's complicated and unbelievably controversial. But there was absolutely no turning my back on what I was seeing.
Now, at a certain point in time, I know that women were being arrested regularly for that communication. Talk a bit about that and what that meant for them, and obviously didn't change anything in terms of what they were doing. But talk about the women you met and what they had to go through with that.
So what the women told me at those early meetings and throughout kind of my work on this issue is that when the police are chasing them around, when the police are criminalizing them and making them, and when they're criminals in the eye of the law and in the eye of police, they spend a lot of their energy trying to avoid police detection. And what that means is that for sex workers who are working on the street, they end up being displaced or moving into very dark and isolated corners of the city where there's nobody there, where the police are unlikely to see them, and there's no one complaining about them being there. So that means industrial areas, under viaducts, in alleys, places where there's absolutely no recourse if you need help, and nobody knows you're there. Very dangerous, very risky circumstances. It meant that sex workers told me that when a client would drive up, they would jump into the vehicle very quickly without actually having any time for conversation before they got in the car, or any opportunity to look in the car, to talk to the guy, to see if he was intoxicated. Jump in because they want to avoid the police and they don't want to be communicating in public. And so they jump in the car, they say, okay, let's just go, and they drive to some other location and then start their dialogue about what services he might want, who is he, what's he willing to pay, what's she willing to do. And so not having an opportunity to look for very important features like, is he sober? Is his name or his license plate on a bad date sheet, which is a sheet that lists predators? Is there anything in the car that looks like a weapon? Sex workers talk about predators coming in the neighborhood who have removed the lock, so they can't actually, so the door's locked and they can't actually pull the unlocking mechanism to get out. And once you're in the vehicle, every sex worker, any woman will tell you, your chance for escape and your chance for having any control over the negotiations is diminished substantially. And then not being able to go to the police because you're confessing to being involved in a criminal offense and being worried about stigma when they do. So this is the sort of context and the reality that's created by these laws. And sex workers were saying, there's all sorts of ways society can support us and support our safety, and this is the exact opposite. Criminalizing us, and in fact criminalizing our clients, going after our clients, just creates this underground, secretive network situation that means we're hiding, we're unsafe, and we aren't able to access support when we need it.
So you must have gotten to know some of the women for a while. Can you talk a bit about that? You've known them maybe for years, and just talk a bit about getting to know them.
Yeah, I mean, that has been the most transformative part of this work for me. Not having any idea, being completely sort of media educated about these issues, or maybe educated through my readings in women's studies or whatever it was I thought I knew about sex work, was completely undone once I started having these conversations. And it was the women and their strength and their vision for social change and their clarity about what they needed that really was the most transformative. And it's something I wish everyone who has opinions and views on these issues could have that same exposure, because it's very hard to support criminal law and criminalization of sex work when you sit down with sex workers, whether you're talking to women in the downtown east side who have very few options and live in really difficult constrained lives, to sex workers who do not, to sex workers who have many options and choose to do this as the one that's best for them. And all of those conversations I've been part of have been amazing and transformative, and it was a really nice way for me to get rid of all of the judgments and assumptions and stereotypes that I carried in my heart and in my head, and just realize that sex workers are experts on their lives. They know what they need, and they're asking Canada to take the criminal law off their backs, and it's time for the courts and government to listen to that.